Sio, Ogio, Egado Heido. That's Cherokee for greetings, welcome, you're on Indian land. And we do applaud when we say we're on Indian land. There you go. My name is Andrew Johnson. I'm the director here at the American Indian Center and am honored to be here and be a part of this today. We really have to thank Melissa Navis and David Bender for all of their efforts and all of the volunteers, Wilson, in pulling together a remarkable meal. So let's give them all a wonderful round of applause too. And is this a great spring day or what? So it's terrific to be out. We are tremendously proud and pleased to welcome back David and welcome Rosalyn here to the American Indian Center to talk about their book. So just a real brief introduction with Rosalyn, that both from the University of Montana, so thank you so much for coming back here. And we did arrange the weather for you. So Rosalyn is an environmental historian, ethnobotanist, writer, and popular public speaker. In her research, writing, and speaking, she blends traditional knowledge learned from elders with academic knowledge. She believes it is important to recognize the link between the loss of linguistic diversity in the world and the loss of ecosystem diversity, and that preserving traditional knowledge and revitalizing indigenous languages serves to help conserve the environment. I've got about 5 pages here of Rosalyn, but it is remarkable with everything that she has done. And with Professor Beck, one of the focal points of his work is to identify and analyze American Indian agency in the course of tribal history. He's a historian with research interests in federal Indian policy, 20th century American Indian history, tribal sovereignty, and urban Indian history. He studied these fields in relation to the Menominee Indian tribe of Wisconsin, Southwest Oregon coast, and the Chicago American Indian community. In teaching, he attempts to provide students with the analytical tools and knowledge base to promote tribal community development. And again, his list of honors, publications, and contributions is quite lengthy too. So I would like to introduce both David and Rosalyn to the American Indian Center. Thank you so very, very much.
All right. Ooh. Well, wow, it's great to be back. And it's great to see a lot of old friends and some new faces for us. And it's really nice to see this big crew in the Indian Center. I think the last time I was here for a big event like this was the last graduation that I oversaw at Nace College, which we held here back in probably 2000, in May or June of 2000. And since then, Rosalyn and I have moved to Montana, and we've been there for the last 15 years. We're just really thrilled to be here and to be able to share some of our work and some of what we've learned in doing this work with this audience here today. And Rosalyn's going to introduce herself as well, and then we'll get to it.
Good afternoon. My name's Rosalyn LaPier. Most of you, maybe the old crowd, knows me. Back from Nace College. I worked at Nace College for 10 years, from about 1990 to about 2000, when we moved back to Montana, where I'm from. I'm from the Blackfeet Reservation. My mother's Blackfeet, my father's Métis. I grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation and lived there until I went to college in Colorado. And when we returned back to Montana, I got a degree in history from the University of Montana. And what we're going to be talking about today is actually started as a project that was my master's thesis. So if you want to read the original You can go online to DePaul University and you can find the original documents about this time period that I did back in 90-something. So, okay. Get going. I don't know what our, sorry.
You're first.
Am I first?
Yes.
We have this all planned out since there's two of us. We don't ever talk at the same time or give presentations together because I'm an environmental historian and I do mostly stuff related to environmental history, and Dave is an American historian, so we rarely talk about the same subjects and we're rarely speaking at the same time. So we actually wrote out an outline of how we're going to do this so that we can. But the other thing I write about and have published about is American Indian activism. And I think American Indian activism is something that's a really interesting topic that people really have not studied, especially during the early period, because for the most part, people have studied, who have written stuff about American Indian activism have done kind of from the AIM movement to the present, so kind of from the 70s to the present. And as you know from the topic of the book, we are from the last turn of the century. So I apologize, I also have allergies right now, so if I stop talking and completely give it to Dave, it's from the allergies. So one of the things that I was interested in doing when I was working on my master's thesis, which I did at DePaul University, I was really interested in urban Indian history before relocation. I was interested in what happened before the 1950s. There has been a lot written about native communities, native urban communities from the 1950s on, and I was kind of interested to see what was going on in urban America in terms of native community and how native communities developed, how organizations developed, what kinds of activism was going on in those communities. So I focused on the city of Chicago, and at that time I was working at NACE College, and for those of you who knew about NACE or were students of NACE, if you remember, there was an archives that was created, and there was kind of collection of lots and lots of information about the Chicago Indian community. And so one of the things in terms of looking at the archives that were there at NACE and then just going around and looking at the University of Illinois, going down to Springfield, looking at the state archives, was trying to uncover sort of this story of Chicago Indian community and what had happened before World War II. So we ended up having a time period between two World's Fairs that were happening in the city of Chicago, the 1893 World's Fair and the 1933-34 Century of Progress Fair. And like I said, one of the things I was really interested in was looking at that early community that was here in the city of Chicago, those early Indian organizations, and the activism that was going on. So that was sort of the initial sort of effort that was made, and that was way back when in the 90s, right? So then we had kids, and we moved, and I went and got a degree in environmental study, or environmental history, and I wrote something completely different. So anyway, it sat on the shelf for almost 20 years. And Dave and I, 4 years ago, decided to pull this topic, or our project, back off the shelf and to look at it again and create a book. So 4 years ago, we sat down, and between my master's thesis and articles that David had written when he also worked at NACE and some of the research he did working at the NACE archives, we pulled together what became this book. So I think you're next.
So the time period for this book between the World's Fairs also coincides with a critically defined time period in United States history that's referred to as the Progressive Era. And so this book, the events in this book take place during the Progressive Era in the city of Chicago. And the Progressive Era was an era that was defined, or is defined by historians, as a time of reform and as a time when urbanization was expanding in the United States. The same year that the World's Fair occurred in 1893, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner famously declared that the frontier had closed in the United States. And what that meant was there was a recognition that more and more people were moving to cities. Obviously, throughout the 20th century, that's what occurred in Chicago. And there were people moving from the countryside into cities, and there were a lot of immigrants coming to the city of Chicago. And Chicago was a central hub for this movement in the United States because of the lake, because of the river that the engineers turned around and made flow down to the Mississippi to send all our sewage the other way instead of into Lake Michigan at the turn of around 1900. And because of the railroads and canals that came through here. So this was a central place for transportation in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the city grew dramatically in terms of its population. And what the reformers were concerned about were all the problems that came with urban growth, whether it was economic problems, social problems, socioeconomic problems, and political corruption, and all those things that kind of defined the dark underbelly of urban growth in that time period. And so there were a broad variety of reformers that came from a lot of walks of life, although mostly from well-to-do families. A lot of the reformers were women who were trying to, in the terms of some historians, feminize policies toward people. And they worked very heavily, especially with immigrant communities in the city. But one sort of focus of the reform movement was aimed directly at American Indians. And so I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with what happened in the late 19th and early 20th century in terms of American Indian history, but I'll say a few words about it. On the plains, for example, the bison had just disappeared, disappeared is kind of a benign way of saying, had just been wiped out by the settlers going across the plains, destroying that basic food source for so many people. The white American expansion was moving into tribal lands during this time period, and beginning in the late 19th century, the policy of establishing reservations and confining American Indian people to their reservation lands and not to their traditional homelands, which were much more expansive, was part of the policy. And by the late 19th century, there was a popular and a perception that was, it permeated popular society, but also policymakers' thoughts and academia, that Indians were disappearing, and Indians were described as a disappearing race. And so the federal policies focused on helping Indians disappear from American society. And the ways that that was done, for example, was to break up the already small reservation lands, to confiscate lands from the tribes, and to give it over to individual American Indians to try to make Indians become farmers. This was the allotment policy. American Indian religions were outlawed. In some places, tribal governments were actually outlawed. In other places, they were just suppressed significantly. Another part of this process then was to educate children in Western schools. And sometimes those were on-reservation schools, and sometimes those were off-reservation schools, and many of those schools were boarding schools, where children were taken away from their family, at times by choice of their families, at other times actually kidnapped from their families and sent away to school, where they would sometimes not see their families again for a couple of decades. And when these children became adults, many of them did move back to the families that they came from, but for a variety of reasons, other people didn't or couldn't. And some of those people who didn't moved to cities. And Chicago was the central place for American Indians to move in this time period. So even though the population of Indians in Chicago was very small at the turn of the century, just a few hundred people, it was also turned out to be a very active place. a place where American Indians who had been forced to move to cities or had been forced to live away from their families came together, and despite the fact that the reformers had tried to assimilate them into American society, they kind of turned that around, and they tried to figure out a way for tribal people to move into the future as part of American society without giving up their tribal values and who they were. And so that the leaders who came to Chicago in that time period, the people who came to that Chicago in that time period and became leaders, were people who became very strong advocates for American Indians in the city and for American Indians back home in their homelands. And I think I've got just one paragraph I want to read, which I didn't mark in here. On page XII. Oh, okay. Pat Zarakos was at our reading the other night, and every time we opened the book, she said, "What page are you on?" so she could follow along. So this is how we describe that process in just one paragraph. Within a generation, a significant number of American Indian children grew up outside of their tribal communities as they attended off-reservation boarding schools. However, as many of these children grew into adulthood, their lives defied the expectations of the reformers. Instead of being reformed and acted upon, they became the reformers and acted on behalf of American Indian concerns. They did not blend in, they stood out, and their ideas of reform differed in significant ways from those of their non-Indian counterparts. At this point, Rosalyn's going to talk about kind of the structure of the book, and then we'll get into the part of the book where part of the talk where we do some readings from the book.
So first off, in the back are bookmarks, and I don't know if anybody got bookmarks. Maybe Abaki or Iku, why don't you just grab a whole bunch of them and give them to folks? Abaki. This is what children are for. Put them to work. So on the bookmark is a website at the very bottom, which should say cityindian.wordpress.com. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning that is because in addition to the book, David and I also published 2 articles about this same time period, and we have PDF copies, so you can just go there for free, and you can copy the article or read the articles. And one of them was from Chicago history. And one of the things that we did in the Chicago history article is we wrote little mini biographies of people. So some of the pictures that you're seeing of individuals that are coming up on the screen in the Chicago history article are these little just mini biographies of just different people who lived in the city of Chicago from 1890 to 1930, and kind of tells their life story a little bit, or sort of why they're important. Another article that we wrote that's also on the same website is an article from the Western History Quarterly. And in that particular article, we wrote really a biography of one individual named Scott Henry Peters. And Scott Henry Peters was a business leader here in the city of Chicago in the 1920s and 30s, and he became part of what was the precursor to the relocation program. So before the relocation program existed, there was another program that was called the placement program, and it had the same types of concerns and issues in terms of moving Native people off reservation and finding them employment in cities. And so Scott Henry Peters actually ran the placement department for kind of the upper Midwest. And so we wrote an article about the placement program itself from the 1930s and sort of Scott Henry Peters. So anyway, those are available. I don't want us to keep sounding like we're selling our book, because we're not. We just want to share the information from it. But there's plenty of information that you can, if you want to learn the same story, you can get it for free. So anyway, now that I'm going to sell my book, so the book is divided up into several different sections. And like I said, what we were interested in at that time period were kind of two things. We were interested in looking at the Native leaders of the past, and we were interested in looking at organizations. So when you're looking at the book, one of the things you're not going to find, for the most part, is sort of the common man, because we really were interested in kind of the activism, the activists, the leadership, and the organizations. For that reason, it does have a very kind of specific story that is being told. There were a lot of common people during that time period, people, you know, who lived in the community, worked in the community, but that's sort of not quite part of the story. So at the beginning of the book, which is in the 1893 World's Fair, one of the first things we talk about is representation. So one of the things that people, especially the leadership, were really interested in was representation of Native people. And as you know, this is still an issue today, right? With the Washington Redskins, with lots of other issues in terms of mascots and other types of representational issues. This was an issue back in the 1890s. So one of the big issues at the 1893 World's Fair was how were Native people being presented and represented to the kind of general audience and to, you know, just the people in general. And so one of the things that the activists at that time and the leadership at that time stood up and spoke about was this idea of representation. So one of our chapters at the beginning is about the 1893 World's Fair and some of what was going on at that time. Before there were organizations in the city of Chicago, there were individual people who became, to a certain extent, kind of social welfare individuals. And one of them was a guy named Dr. Carlos Montezuma. And Dr. Carlos Montezuma was a doctor who came to live in the city of Chicago. He lived here most of his life. And he, because, as David said, Chicago was such a central location, Native people came through here in and out all of the time. If there was any kind of issue, if somebody got sick, if there was an issue of somebody running out of money, if somebody needed a job, any of those kinds of what we'd consider today kind of social welfare type issues, Dr. Carlos Montezuma would step in as an individual, and he would be kind of the mediator, and he would help those people. And because he was such a well-known figure in Chicago and nationally, everybody knew who he was. So he sort of filled in that role of what we would consider sort of social welfare before organizations existed. Then in 1919, one of the first, the first Indian organization in the city of Chicago was created, which was an organization called the Indian Fellowship League. And the Indian Fellowship League started as an organization that was both native and non-native. And they were interested in lots of different issues, but they were primarily, again, kind of an activist type organization. They eventually ceased to exist because there became internal conflict between the native members of the organization and the non-native members, because eventually, as they evolved in a very short amount of time, the native people wanted to do more things that had to do with, again, helping people who were coming to the city with issues, again, with employment and some of those concerns. And the non-native members of the organization were more interested in things like preserving. At that time, that's when the forest preserve movement was going on, was like setting aside areas for the forest preserve. And so there was a conflict between native and non-native. The second organization that got started was the Indian Council Fire, which was called the Grand Council Fire at that time. And again, it was an organization that was both native and non-native. And that existed for a very long time as an organization, except over time it evolved from being a mixed native, non-native organization to all of the natives basically quitting the organization and becoming sort of a non-native organization for many years. So we also have a chapter about that organization and its evolution and sort of what happened during the early years. And we end our book with the Century of Progress Fair. So the Century of Progress Fair, if you haven't heard about it, was a fair in 1933 and in 1934 that celebrated the 100th anniversary of sort of the creation of Chicago. And it was this huge... Okay, you're getting an F. If you were in my class.
He was in your class.
Wait, you were in my class. So with the Century of Progress Fair, again, this issue of representation comes up. So there's this, non-natives are trying to define what Native people should look like, dress like, et cetera. Here it is, 1933. It's, years since the original, World's Fair. And Native people, again, by that time, because of organizations, because of individual Indians who were here for a very long time, there was a much stronger sort of activist voice at the 1933 World's Fair. And between 33, when the original fair happened, to 34, when the second year of the fair happened, there was really a big difference between sort of Indian participation and Indian people really standing up and speaking out about representational issues. One of the things that happened in the 34 fair was that Native people wanted to show Indian people of the present kind of the same, again, these same issues that come up even today. So one of the things they created in the 34 fair, they created a thing called the Hall of Honor, and they had photographs of Native people of that time, and they wrote biographies of them. And one of the things they wanted to show the people who came to the fair was like, here are Native people of today. And what evolved out of that Hall of Honor was a book that the Ground Council Fire created called Indians of Today. And some of you may have seen that at some point. It was originally published in 1936. And some of those natives that are in that Indians of Today are from the city of Chicago. And then it evolved. There were 4 editions over the years to kind of this national biography of Native leaders from around the United States. So that was something that evolved here from the city of Chicago. So anyway, that's sort of the format of our book. We kind of go from this kind of individual Native people, the fair, the different organizations. There was also a women's organization that existed, but I don't think we have a complete chapter on it, kind of in there, which is the First Daughters of America. And that was an organization, maybe when we see her picture going by. Dave's going to talk about the leader of that organization in a little bit. But that was one of the first women's Native organization that was created in the whole United States, that was created here in Chicago. And it existed, again, for many years. And it was an organization that was interested in education. And one of the things that they did was they raised money to send young Indian women to school and to get college degrees, which was extremely rare, again, during this time period. So that's sort of the structure. I'm already losing my voice. Sorry. That's the structure of our book. And again, if you're interested in sort of reading more stuff and for free, look on the website.
So I'm going to start by reading a brief, a kind of short reading that deals with what Rosalyn was talking about in terms of representation. And I'd also just like to point out that when we wrote about individuals in this time period, when we included their tribal affiliations, which we did whenever we could, we used the terminology that they used for who they identified as. So sometimes over time the names of tribal groups has changed, but we tried to be historically accurate here. If somebody identified themselves as Chippewa, we identified themselves as Chippewa. If somebody identified themselves as Winnebago or Sioux, we did it that way in this book.
So mention the title too, in that same vein.
And the title of the book is City Indian, and that was also a terminology that was used in the 1920s and 30s. There were kind of 2 terms for American Indians who were moving to cities. that both Indian and non-Indian people used to identify Indians. And one was city Indians, and the other was migrating Indians. And so we titled the book City Indian because that's how they, people who were moving to cities were referred to in the 20s and 30s. And I'm starting on the first page of the book here, first page of chapter 1, to give you an idea of what Indian leaders who were focusing on representation to the outside world of who Indians were in the modern world, the then modern world, to what they were dealing with in terms of the popular perception of who American Indians were among non-Indians. So we start. More than any event in Chicago history, save the fire of 1871, the Fort Dearborn massacre, massacre in quotes, defines Chicago identity. Although this event occurred on the American frontier during the War of 1812, which was fought between the United States and Britain on Potawatomi territory, the city of Chicago took the story as its own. It helped support both the rugged individualism of the American character and the belief that Americans inexorably wrested this area away from the British and the Indians. With this narrative of conquest, Chicagoans could legitimately claim this area as their own, or so they thought. The story of the massacre became one of legend and lore for the emerging metropolis of Chicago. By the end of the 19th century, it grew to mythic proportions, retold for the masses in numerous dime store novels. The myth grew to the extent that the industrialist, George Pullman, commissioned a massive public sculpture by the famed artist Carl Roll Smith to be placed next to the Pullman Mansion in the South Loop. The completed monument features two American Indians, one trying to kill a white woman and the other trying to save her. Roll Smith, in designing the sculpture, wanted what he referred to as real Indians to model for the work. He was in luck. He found them at Fort Sheridan, north of the city. In February 1891, a Sioux delegation of more than 40 prisoners of war came to Illinois from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. They were brought in the wake of the U.S. Army's attack on Lakota civilians and religious celebrants at Wounded Knee the previous December. The delegation was divided into two parts. One stayed in Chicago for several days and then traveled on to Washington, D.C., while the other group was held as guests of the government, a euphemism for prisoners of war, at Fort Sheridan. There, the corrupt South Dakota politician M.H. Day referred to them as murderers. The group that was held at Fort Sheridan included Shortbull, whom the sculptor Carl Roll Smith purportedly believed looked like a typical Indian. The local Potawatomi Indians did not look Indian enough for Roll Smith to depict in a seminal event in Chicago history. Instead, Roll Smith selected the Lakota man to model the Potawatomi black partridge saving Mrs. Lanai Helm at Fort Dearborn in what would become the iconic Chicago Monument. Already, Plains Indians represented the archetypical Indian image for white America. The Roll Smith sculpture was emblematic of the portrayal of Chicago's native history that would dominate the consciousness of Chicagoans at the beginning of the 20th century. In a foreshadowing of future conditions, Indians were placed in a dichotomous situation of being both allies and untrustworthy others in relation to non-native Chicagoans. And now Rosalyn's going to do a couple of readings.
You might be doing a couple of readings.
Here's your first one.
What are we doing? Where are
Pokagan
we?
and then Peters.
Oh, okay. We'll see if I lose my voice. Okay, so one of the, I'm going to take off my glasses because I can't see books. Now I can't see you guys. So one of the things that happened at the 1893 World's Fair, and again, was this idea of Indian participation and Indian representation. And one of the leaders at that time period was a gentleman named Simon Pokagon. And some of you in this room, I'm sure, have heard of Simon Pokagon. He's Potawatomi, and as you know, Chicago was part of Potawatomi territory. One of the things that happened with Simon Pokagon over the years was he was constantly in different types of legal land issues with the city of Chicago in terms of land ownership. He was also sort of an outspoken, political leader. Because of his activism at that time period, he became well known among Chicago public figures. He was friends with the mayor of the city of Chicago, and many of these Native activists at this time period, between the 1890s and the 1930s, had very intimate relationships with the leadership of the city of Chicago. They would be at public events all of the time with the mayor or alderman. They would be at public events with the leadership in terms of cultural leadership, like the Chicago Historical Society, or again, at that time, they were trying to create all of these forest preserves with people who were working for the county governments. So what I'm going to read to you is, it's passed a couple of times on the screen here, was basically an essay that Simon Pokagon wrote in protest to what he saw was happening at the 1893 World's Fair. So this is Simon Pokagon speaking, not us. In behalf of my people, the American Indians, I hereby declare to you, the pale-faced race that has usurped our lands and homes, that we have no spirit to celebrate with you the great Columbian Fair now being held in this city of Chicago, the wonder of the world. No sooner would we hold high joy day over the graves of our departed fathers than to celebrate our own funeral, the discovery of America. So remember, the Columbian Fair was the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America. So later, this is us speaking, us writing. In his effort to advocate on behalf of tribal people, Pokagon continued to lobby the mayor. When he heard that, and you guys are going to laugh about this in just a sec. When he heard that Mayor Harrison claimed to be part Indian, he wrote a letter requesting help in bringing Potawatomi people to Chicago to participate in the fair in a way that would be more appropriate and more functional than the props or mere visitors. So this is Pokagon speaking. This is a letter that he wrote to the mayor of Chicago. I heard with pleasure that the blood of Pocahontas flows in your veins. And as one of my people, I call upon you to help the educated Indians of our great country in their efforts to celebrate this great fair. Many of my people have already come and found no place for them in this celebration. So he reminded the mayor that the United States still had not paid the Potawatomi for the land on which the fair was being held. This became a big issue for Pokagon. So this is Pokagon speaking again. All we ask from Chicago is that the people help us to come and join with them and the world in telling how great is our common country. So one of the issues that Pokagon and other activists at this time period, when they spoke to political figures, was they did remind people of, as you announced, this is Indian land. Back in those days, they'd say this is our common land, that this was Indian land that now, in the city of Chicago, people were living. So there was always this idea, even back then, 1890s, where they're reminding people that that Chicago is Indian territory. So, go ahead. Oh, I'm going again. Okay. You may go. Sorry, I'm already, after 15 years, I've not grown used to the plants that are out here, so. I started having allergies in Minneapolis. Okay, so this is a little bit of a longer piece that was written by Scott Henry Peters, who I'd mentioned before. So Scott Henry Peters he identified as Chippewa. He's originally from Michigan. He was educated at Carlisle, and he came to live here in the city of Chicago. He became a very successful businessman. He owned a tailor shop and what we'd consider today like a dry cleaning shop. And because he became a successful businessman, he again became part of the cultural community in the city of Chicago. So he was invited to a lot of activities and stuff like that. Okay, so at some point there was a picture that went by, for those of you who actually have a book right now, it's on 125, of the mayor of the city of Chicago, Big Bill Thompson, wearing a headdress. And Scott Peters is the Indian guy who's in the business suit. So this was during a celebration, and Scott Henry Peters is, again, advocating for Native representation. And at that time period, one of the things that was going on in the city of Chicago was they were changing, as we always do, changing the curriculum, right? What was going to be taught in the schools, et cetera. And one of the things that Mayor Bill Thompson was fighting against was this idea that he thought, quote unquote, that our curriculum in the city of Chicago was too British, and he wanted more American history being taught throughout the curriculum. And so he started this America First campaign in the city of Chicago, and it was like this huge battle between the superintendent of public schools and the mayor of Chicago. So this is Scott Peters advocating on behalf of Native people. He wrote this in 1927. We do not know if school histories are pro-British, but we do know that they are unjust to the life of our people, the American Indians. They call all white victories battles, and all Indian victories massacres. The battle with Custer has been taught to school children as a fearful massacre on our part. We ask that this, as well as other incidents, be told fairly. If the Custer battle was a massacre, what was Wounded Knee? History books teach that Indians were murderers. Is it murder to fight in self-defense? Indians killed white men because white men took their lands, ruined their hunting grounds, burned their forests, destroyed their buffalo. White men penned our people on reservations, then took away the reservations. White men who rise to protect their property are called patriots. Indians who do the same are called murderers. White men call Indians savages. What is civilization? Its marks are a noble religion and philosophy, original arts, stirring music, rich story and legend. We had these. Then we were not savages, but a civilized race. We made blankets that were beautiful and that the white man, with all his machinery, has never been able to duplicate. We made baskets that were beautiful. We wove in beads and colored quills, designs that were not just decorative motifs, but were the outward expression of our very thoughts. Put in your history books the Indians' part in the World War. This is World War I. Tell how the Indian fought for a country of which he was not a citizen, for a flag to which he has no claim, and for a people that have treated him unjustly.
So that may be familiar to some of you. Debbie, Kermit, Nora, Robert, Ina, probably all had to read that in one of my classes. And one of the things that's striking about it is how little has changed in some ways over the years. And so as we read these historical, Star probably read it too, I imagine. As we read these historic documents, sometimes they seem very current. Peters was a businessman, and he was the president of the Grand Council Fire when he wrote that and presented it to the mayor of Chicago. Another activist, and the person I'd like to talk about next, and I'm going to read a little bit lengthier commentary here, though our bookmarks are a little mixed up, is a woman who's occasionally shows up on the screen. Her name was Chanina Blackstone, and she was simply known as Chanina. She was one of two co-founders of the First Daughters of America. The other co-founder was Anna Fitzgerald. And I remember more than a quarter of a century ago, I published a bibliography on American Indians in Chicago, and I was visiting with Susan Power about it way back then, 25 years ago, and she admonished me that I better pay attention to the women in that early time period, and she specifically mentioned Mrs. Fitzgerald, who for many years was the president of the First Daughters of America. But at the beginning, she was one of the two co-founders, and the other co-founder was a woman named Chanina Blackstone. And there were actually 10 Native women in this club, and they identified themselves as Oneida, Iroquois, Pueblo, Penobscot, Cherokee Creek, and Chippewa. And so they were from a variety of tribal backgrounds here in Chicago, and they joined together and joined the Illinois Federation of Women's Clubs, which was a very large organization across the state that had for already, by 1930, had for more than a quarter of a century been active in trying to work with Indian issues. There was almost every women's club had a committee that worked with Indian issues in one way or another. This was a unique club because it was made up of American Indian women, and so they became an essential part of the whole statewide organization, and they lasted well beyond this time period that we're writing about. And this is what we wrote. The founding president of the First Daughters of America, Chanina Blackstone, lived both in the Stevens Hotel on Michigan Avenue and on Delaware Street at various times. Blackstone was also referred to as Princess Chanina and was known by her first name. "I'm not really an Indian princess," she once laughingly told a Chicago Tribune reporter. "You see, there is no such thing as an Indian princess. My father was a Cherokee Creek chief, and for that reason the white man conferred the title upon me, and it has always remained." Chanina was an exceptional and popular performer who outfitted herself in a buckskin beaded dress of her own design that fairly typified the public's expectations of a typical Indian princess. She worked together on stage with Charles Wakefield Cadman, a non-Indian composer who wrote Indian-inspired music. The most well-known piece they performed together was Cadman's composition, From the Land of the Sky Blue Water. Chanina performed in Chicago as early as 1916 and 1917 at the Ziegfeld Theater, where her performances drew rave reviews and record-setting audiences. She served as president of the First Daughters from 1930 until approximately 1934. Chanina had become involved in politics during the 1928 presidential election when she campaigned, rather against her will, she said at first, with Republican vice presidential candidate Charles Curtis, a senator from Kansas. Curtis was raised in part on the Kaw Reservation, and under Herbert Hoover became the first Native American elected to the vice presidency of the United States. When Curtis failed to appear for a rally in Minneapolis, Chanina explained his absence to the audience and then discussed the tariff issue. "I remembered some of the phrases I had heard the speakers use," she recalled, "and I just repeated them." She went on to make speeches throughout the campaign, and she held thousands spellbound by her eloquence. After the speeches, the audience would shout for her popular opera numbers, which she would sing as an encore. Both her political background and her celebrity status played an important role in bringing recognition to the First Daughters. When commenting to the press, Chanina emphasized the role that the organization played in promoting Indian welfare. All of the Indian members were involved in welfare work, which formed the basis of the organization's purposes. They met every 2 weeks in each other's homes to plan their activities. In January 1932, Chanina reported to the Chicago Tribune, quote, "Our greatest piece of work has been the opening of a shop to help the Indian people market their wares directly to the public without a middleman. This not only stimulates them to greater effort, but develops the arts to a higher degree of perfection. Our club has raised $240 on a scholarship fund, of which an Indian girl who aspires to be a professional pianist is taking advantage. In addition, we have sent 10 complete layettes, sets of baby clothing and other necessities, to Indian mothers and hundreds of garments to other needy Indians," unquote. The shop that Chanina established, referred to in the press as an American Indian Emporium, was located in the Loop at 540 North Michigan Avenue, just down the street from Fred Layton's Indian trading post. Chanina's Emporium, called American Indian Shop in the phone book, attracted native artifact collectors such as John L. Kraft, the owner of Kraft Phoenix Cheese Corporation and donor of the totem pole that's down on North Lakeshore Drive, to the City Park District. The city purchased goods such as Navajo rugs from tribal members in reservation communities to sell to wealthy Chicagoans. Chanina observed that the shop served several purposes. It provided economic opportunity for Indian artisans, it encouraged the perpetuation of Indian arts, and by displaying such intricately made artwork, it helped combat stereotypes that Indians were lazy and that their arts were primitive. It embraced the commercialization of American Indian cultural art as a method of economic uplift for tribal artists and played into the romantic notions of wealthy collectors. However, it served as one of the few avenues for Indians to create their own representations of themselves and portray them to the public through their artwork. The shop was only open for approximately 2 years and apparently went out of business by 1934. I never found it in the phone book after that. During World War I, Chanina had left her career to entertain troops in Europe. She later recalled, "For the first time in my life, I was learning that the world is what you make it, and I had an even deeper pride in my heart for being an American Indian," unquote. Although Chanina used her Indian identity on stage in a way that helped cement stereotypical American views of Native women, her role as an opera singer helped to contradict those stereotypes. American Indians had to make complex decisions in order to succeed and to appeal to the public. Chanina also used her identity and fame to benefit impoverished tribal people. Through her club work, she helped the First Daughters and other women's clubs to provide relief for individuals and tribal communities, as well as opportunities for individuals to begin to make a professional or financial success in modern America. The Christian Science Monitor summed up her contributions to Indians in Chicago this way: "Chanina is a typically modern woman, combining with her political and artistic activities a business career. Her American Indian shop in a fashionable Chicago district is an exchange run for the benefit of reservation women who are invited to send their handcraft products here for sale." After she left the First Daughters, then Anna Fitzgerald took over as president of that organization. And so one of the things that we really tried to figure out in some ways, I guess, was what were these activists facing in terms of the way the outside world viewed American Indians, and what were they trying to do to, in the words of Scott Peters, determine our own destiny. We've got a quote on the back of the bookmark from Scott Peters that really, in some ways, emphasizes the whole thesis of our book. In fact, that was one of the phrases that we wanted to use as a title for the book, but we had about a month-long negotiation with the press before we ended up with the title that we ended up with. So I'm going to read from our conclusion where we kind of draw together some of these ideas in terms of what people were facing and how they dealt with that and how they used their privileged position or their elite position to advocate on behalf of American Indians, both in the city and nationwide. Chicagoans took great pride in the city's Indian legacy. They named some 60 streets in the city directly for American Indian people, tribes, or words, not including the streets named for towns that derive from Indian names, such as Peoria or Waseca. Numerous statues and monuments, including Roll Smith's, have adorned Chicago's landscape, some since the 19th century. The city recognized its Indian heritage, but to a large degree it relegated Indians to simply that, its heritage, its past. Most Chicagoans viewed Indians through this historic lens rather than trying to understand or accept them as contributing members on an equal footing with white Chicagoans. These perspectives from the outside society only made life in the city more difficult for Native Americans in many ways. As Roy Oshkosh, a Menominee man, commented to a Chicago Tribune reporter when visiting the city in 1927, "We like our modern comforts now." This simple observation is a profound commentary. Indians in the city were not trying to cling to some romanticized, distant past, but often it seemed that using that past was the only way to capture the attention of the rest of Chicago's citizenry. American definitions of modernity declared that culturally non-Western peoples needed to assimilate into Euro-American society as a condition for entering into the contemporary world. This put Indians into an untenable position, which they tried very hard to reverse. If they retained outward expressions of their heritage and shared those with the public, they were viewed as curiosities and little more than reflections of their ancestors. Still, this provided some with an opportunity to make a living and provided a place to create community and develop kinship relations. Whirling Thunder, who we also write about in this book, is an example of this. His work provided him the opportunity to share parts of his culture and to educate white society in a way that was comfortable to him and to interact positively with other city Indians. Others, such as Chanina, used the outward appearances in a conscious effort to manipulate public opinion. By referring to herself as a princess to the press and dressing in native regalia for her concerts, she assured herself of an audience to which she could promote her agenda for native rights. She was consciously aware of the trade-off she was making, and others were aware of the implications as well. The decisions they made regarding the extent to which they should commodify their own cultures were difficult indeed for those who thought about it. While some staunch reformers such as Carlos Montezuma rejected such displays entirely, others, such as Scott Peters, who reflected a lot of Montezuma's sentiments, would act the part of the stereotypical Indian at the World's Fair. At the same time, however, he presented himself as a successful businessman and advocated strongly to change the images of Indians that the fair and the city of Chicago represented to the public. This all made for a messy, complicated road to the future. City Indians desired to live well in Chicago while not discarding their tribal heritage. They developed community and kinship relationships that lasted years. Professional Indians used their privileged status and elite contacts to advocate on behalf of both tribal rights and broader societal understanding of Native American cultures, histories, and issues. And thank you, and we'll take questions and comments at this point.
My great uncle, he was in the, he's a baseball Hall of Famer, and I believe he pitched for the Chicago White Sox in around that time period. So I was wondering if you cover any of that in the book.
The answer is yes. You probably saw a photograph of. Oh, I'm by this. Yeah, we're gonna move this over here. Come back here. Okay. So when the slideshow goes through, you'll see one photograph of two baseball coaches, and one is Charles Albert Bender, who must be your relative. Yeah, and he was just an amazing baseball player. He was he played for Connie Mack in the Philadelphia Athletics, and Connie.
Just had Dave started. Oh my God.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a baseball fan too. There's not going to be time for anybody else's questions after this, David. Connie Mack was one of the is one of the most well-known owners ever in baseball history, and he referred to Charles Albert Bender as the greatest money pitcher of all time. And many baseball historians still view him as, if not the greatest pitcher of all time, one of the greatest pitchers of all time in terms of pressure games. And there are a couple of really good, there's especially one really good biography of him. I don't know if you've read it. It's by Tom Swift, but you should look at that if you're interested in this story, because he does a good job of showing what Charles Bender had to deal with as a Native American baseball player in the 1920s. Almost every game when he pitched, somebody would yell a racial epithet at him. He was known in the press as Chief Bender. He said all he ever wanted to be known as was a baseball player and a pitcher, but we couldn't find a single newspaper article that didn't refer to him as Chief or Savage or some other term to kind of stereotype him as an American Indian. And he dealt with it in various ways. One thing he was well known for was when somebody would yell an epithet at him, he'd turn around and face the stands and yell back, "Foreigner!" Which made the press on occasion, so people did recognize what he was doing. He was no longer an active baseball player by the 1920s, but the Chicago White Sox hired him as a pitching coach, and they had a pitcher named Ted Blankenship who had the best years of his career when Bender was his coach. But he also worked for, I believe, the Army College, so he would work until their season was over and then come work for the White Sox, which he did for 3 years. And he pitched a couple of games for the White Sox as well, even though he was well past his prime. So yeah, thanks for the question. And also that article that we wrote in the Chicago History Magazine, which is on our website, he's one of the people we have a little biography of. And he is featured a couple of times in the book. Other questions, comments, or repercussions? Confusion.
Forgot Jim Thorpe lived here for a while too. Yes, he did. And he was very, very humble. And he'd come to the early council fire meetings, and I always felt so sorry for him because he was so great and some of the people didn't know it, but he always made sure his clothes were ironed and his shoes were shined. And there were a lot of good people here that no one will even ever remember or know their names. But there was a Chippewa woman. We didn't say Ojibwe, we said Chippewa then. Her name was Clara Pemberton Krause. She was from Red Lake. She lived in a little apartment over on Halstead Street. No Indian ever went without food. And especially on holidays, she'd send out her son and some others, go find anyone that's hungry and bring them in. She cooked and cooked and cooked. But all those great ones that did so much will never be known, but I remember them all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So David knows a lot more about this than I do, but there were a lot of professional, during that time period, there were a lot of Native Americans who were professional sports figures, either in football, baseball, or they were coaches. One of the people that keeps going by, we never mentioned him, but he's in the book a lot, was a guy who was actually a football coach at Wabash College, and he moved to the city of Chicago, and he worked for Spalding for many, many years, and he actually worked up at the Naval Training Center. So during that time period, there was a lot of Native people who were in sport, professional sports, and had different roles. So you find them throughout, and we mention a few in the book. who became activists.
Excuse me, but one of the most famous, the prima ballerina of the United States of America was Maria Tallchief, and she was here. And her daughter still lives here. And I remember her when we opened our first center at 411 North LaSalle. The elevator never worked. We were up on the second and third floor. And I remember this beautiful, beautiful woman walking up those stairs and walking so straight. Oh, I never forgot her beautiful walk, and to leave us a check. And I remember going to the Opera House to see her dance in, was it Red? Wasn't Swan Lake, it was another one with red in the title. And how beautiful she was, and at the end, we went backstage, and how gracious she was to us. Now, I'll probably be on my way home, I'll be thinking of all the others I forgot. Next time I'll remember.
Yeah, those are some great stories.
In your slideshow, there's a picture of lots of different natives with a member of the clergy. I was just curious what the backstory is on that particular picture. I understand a lot of Native organizations did work with the Catholic Church to preserve their culture, but then there were also groups that try to downplay their beliefs and kind of replace them with their own. So I was just kind of curious what the story was behind that picture.
Yeah, that's a good question. There was a Eucharistic conference that the Catholic Church held here in the 1920s, and a group of Menominee people came down from the Menominee Reservation just for that conference. And so they were photographed. That picture is actually in the Marquette University archives, but there's a strong Catholic presence in the Menominee community since, depending on how you look at it, either since the early 1700s or since the mid-1800s. And so a large minority of Menominees have been Catholic by the time of this conference for 75 years or more. So they sent a contingent down to participate in a national Catholic conference that was not just focused on Indian issues, but it was on religious issues. So if you have a copy of the book, or even if you don't, because we're going to donate one to the Indian Center for their library here, you can look in the back. We have an appendix where we listed, it starts on page 177. We went through the census and other documents, and we made an effort to list every American Indian who we could identify who lived in Chicago, and got as much information as we could into this. It's just a chart that goes on for pages and pages. And the first one is the 1920 census, and the next one is the 1930 census. But it gives their name, their age, their date of birth, what kind of work they do, where they live, and when known, their tribal affiliation. So that's a good way for people. In fact, we gave a talk at a bookstore in Missoula, Montana the other day, and somebody came up to me and said, my uncle lived in Chicago in the 1930s, and we looked back there, and her uncle was in the book there.
So yeah, the list in the back is just people we could find. As you guys know, with census, it's kind of hit or miss, right? I mean, in terms of if you can find Native people. So these are just the folks that we found. But I'm sure there were other people that were living at that time period here in Chicago, and they just didn't make it into the different census records that we went through. So.
Yeah. Actually, Scott Peters was listed as white in the census, and so was Carlos Montezuma. So the census wasn't always accurate. We have a question from Star that I'll let Rosalyn address first. And that is to define and discuss the term we use, representation, and what representation means.
Mine's just a comment. My name is Jerry Savage. I'm a Ho-Chunk Indian. It's been 40 years ago since I was here last, and we used to come here every week, or once a month. My grandfather would MC the powwow. He'd have powwows here once a month, every month we would come up here. My grandfather would MC the powwow, my grandmother would have a little vendor stand, and I'd run the little dart stand, and then I'd come out and dance. We did a little bit of everything, but the young woman that spoke earlier, she remembered my grandparents. They were fixtures up here. I remember the ride up here every month. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. My grandfather was Chief Walks with the Wind. He was actually a Nebraska Winnebago that was with the Traveling Wild West show. He was relocated into Starved Rock in 1935 by the governor of Illinois, who thought there should be Native Americans back in Starved Rock, only after a century where they all were removed. So, but it's great to be back here amongst a lot of my brothers that I've not met before, and some that I have. It's just great to be back. It's only taken me 40 years to get back. Thank you for listening to me.
I was like, so quickly, I think there was a couple other folks in the way back. Oh. Well, no, we'll address representation in a moment, but as we think of an answer. I don't know.
Hello, I'm Andrea. Actually, my comment is on the lines of representation, only because you were talking about how activists in the past had to deal with the commodification of our culture, and I feel like it's like what I am doing as an activist right now parallels with what you talked about in the book, with having to deal with people not putting us and not honoring us in the correct way when it comes to, like you said, mascots, or even when it comes to fashion. You can go to any store today and you can see tribal motifs and yeah, stuff like that. Like you can see tribal wear, and it's not Indian. It's not made by us. It's made by white corporations, and they're trying to get that this aesthetic of this like noble, savage type thing. So, like, do you feel that like it's a continuation, like any continuation of that, or like do you feel like the activists in the past, that they even put a dent in it, or do you feel like it's just grown so big that like my generation of activists are having to deal with misappropriation and cultural appropriation and the commodification of our culture? Like, where do like we stand in that mash?
So first of all, it looks like they've been putting dessert out. So I think if people want to come up and grab a dessert while we're kind of having a conversation, feel free to go grab something to eat while it's sitting out there. So you don't have to wait while we're... So representation has always been an issue. And this is one of the... So in terms of what activists were interested in back in the 1890s, right, with the Columbian World's Fair, it's the same issue that Native people are interested in today. And it ultimately comes down to the word control, right? Native people want control of the images of themselves. And this has been an issue for over 100 years. And in the 1893 World's Fair, which we wrote about, this was a huge issue then, because at that time period, they had two completely different groups that were representing Indians. One was anthropologists. So the anthropologists at that time were creating native villages where native people came and they were dressed up like Indians, as defined at that time. Then there was also, as you've seen with the slides that have been going through, there was the Buffalo Bill show. And Buffalo Bill also was doing the same thing, kind of creating kind of native people who were, so the difference is, during that fair, which was also more than 1 year, native people kind of saw what was going on, and they wanted to have some say. And so in terms of the activism that was occurring at that time, one of the things they wanted to do was just sort of have say over how they were being represented, the clothing they were wearing, etc. And they did make some headway in terms of what was going on in that fair. There were some groups of native people who, because native people were being represented in the fair with, dressed up in villages, then there was the Buffalo Bill Show. There were some native groups that actually rented property along the midway by the show and had their own shows where they dressed the way they wanted to dress and sold crafts that they wanted to sell and did it completely on their own so that they were the ones representing themselves. During the time period of our book, all the way up to the 1933-34 Century of Progress Fair, the same issues are happening throughout in terms of who's actually doing the representing. Is it non-native people representing native people, or is it native people representing themselves? And so that was still sort of this continuum of an issue all the way through. They did make a little more headway in the second fair in the sense of, like I had mentioned earlier, they created the Hall of Honor, they had books that came out, they tried to represent, at that time they wanted to represent native people as modern and not just people of the past. But the issue of sort of Indians as people of the past, Indians as urban Indians or city Indians, people of the present, that continues to today. So, and I think that people have, there's a lot more headway today, except, I don't know, don't get me, if you look at places like Urban Outfitters or, I don't know if people saw recently the Urban Outfitters thing where they were selling the sacred sage. I can't remember what it was called now, but yeah. I know they shut it down, but they were selling it in the first place, so anyway. So on the one hand, they do shut it down if you protest and you advocate. So you can jump in if you want to.
Yeah, I think that I have one thing to say about this, and that is that in the time period we're writing about and in the present, change only occurs really when Native people stand up for their rights. And if you don't do that, then you're going to get plowed under. But if you do stand up, you can also find allies outside of the Indian community who will stand up with you and shut down that crazy sale of sacred sage and things like that. But it's a constant battle. We had a friend who was an elder chief of the Coos tribe on the Oregon coast, and he paraphrased an famous old saying in both American and Roman history. And he always used to say that the price of sovereignty is eternal vigilance, and the price of progress is eternal vigilance as well. So and sometimes it feels like, why do we have to keep fighting these battles over and over again? Because if you don't keep fighting them, you're going to get plowed under. So I really applaud the work of young activists and of people who are working within communities to make those communities better places. And sometimes it really feels like you're running into a tornado trying to do it. But when you look at the historical record and then you look at what's going on now, it gives you hope that we can make this world a little bit better place for our children. And that's what we're always trying to do.
So let me make one final comment, and I think we'll just stop here, and then if people have questions or comments, just come up, and then folks can enjoy dessert. One of the reasons we were really interested in writing a book like this, again, was we wanted to present this really long story of the Chicago Indian community. A lot of times the Chicago Indian, now called urban, right, Indian community, people present it as being created in the 1950s, 1960s, Indians moved here, but it has a very long history, and I think it has a very rich and complex history that when you learn about it, it gives a longer continuity to the people who live here and continue to live here, and again, we're on Indian land. But sort of learning that story, I think, is an important thing to kind of know the whole long, complex history of Chicago urban Indian community. So.
That means stop.
And that means stop. Yeah. Thank you for coming.
Was that terrific or what? Are we indebted to Rosalyn and David? Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And we do have a couple of items. Actually, I'd like to introduce Melissa Navis, part of our board of directors, our secretary.
Hi, everyone. Wow, this is tall. Okay, that's better. On behalf of the center, we would like to thank Professor Dave Beck and Rosalyn LaPier for coming today. This is from our board president, Sharon Skolnick. She's a very respected and loved community member and president of the board of directors. And this is her artwork that she created, and she couldn't be here today, but she wanted to say that she wants to extend her hugs and gratitude for being present and sharing with all of us your time and energy. So I'm just going to read this is from her gallery, and the title is Proud Spirit of the Night, acrylic on buffalo skin. So for everybody to see. So here you go.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And Sharon is an old friend of ours, so this is really a special gift.
Until about Green Bay, you out. Until about, 2 minutes ago, I didn't know these two were a couple. So I was thinking I'd have to give them a painting apiece, which I don't have. So I'm giving them this in honor of all the NACE people, the NACE graduates, the NACE, I don't know if it passed. Did you pass me? Well, anyway, here. You can fight over there.
Thank you very much, Robert. And the answer is in some classes, yes, and in others, no.
All right, again, thank you very much.